Okay.
So I want to start off with Denise, who spent a lot of time recently getting these stories online, talking about where she thinks we stand and kind of the big picture of where this project fits into Plexus. So I know I haven't told you that, Denise, but I would love you to start it off.
Well, thank you. And it's literally been moment by moment. So, hey, Peter, how are you?
Oh,
Nice to
nice.
see you. So
Nice to see you.
Peter, Bruce, and Mark have been my my experiments. I'm just joking, but I've used the 3 papers that you've completed, and I have set up, actually literally 5 minutes ago, I finished updating everybody's what I call the author landing page, and it's really starting to come together. And as we know, it always opens up other things that we need to sort of think, does this fit, doesn't this fit? And one of the things that really sort of dawned on me as I was going through this was that we really, and Brooke had mentioned this very early on in the process, being able to reference easily the sort of terminology or concepts that were used in any of the papers related to complexity, either the science of it or a specific definition, or if there was something specific in how that word or terminology was being used, should be linked somehow. And so what I've done now is I've created on the template a really easy way in which we can start to list the terms that are used. And if you go to any of the pages, I've put complex adaptive systems on everybody's page, and I've also included a link to a newly updated overall glossary that that Jeff Goldstein had originally done. And Bruce was gracious enough to say that he notices some things needed to be updated, some things needed to be added. I'm going to loop him in, or I'm going to lasso him, to be very honest with you, into doing that. Don't say something you aren't willing to do.
I'm into that.
But what it will do is then we can put it on the site. And the goal would be that at some point in time, we would have one glossary, which we have. And then we have another reference, which is key terms and terminology references that came from Adaptive Positive Deviance book. But that will be where we can link other, what I will call less scientific, but ways in which things are used. So I think there'll be 2 different references, but this is the important thing. When a paper is done, and I know we're recording this, so hopefully people will look at it, we need to have not only the list of the terms, but sort of the definitions or where they came from. And if they're from the site, all you need to do is just, cut and paste whatever the definition is on the site, and then ultimately there'll be a full toggle list that we can sort of pick and choose from, but it will make it really easy for me or whomever is doing the updating, because the pages really did take a huge amount of time. But part of that was just being able to get the template. So we have user names, profiles, social media. Peter's has been updated because he has references. He has a book, and he's also submitted a blog post, which we're going to put up, and Prusha's working on yet. Hi, Prusha. I know that you're just listening, but Prusha had some surgery, and I hope you're doing okay. Just say yes, please.
Yes.
Okay, yay.
Yay.
Yay. But Prusha's been, working diligently in the background. And so what we hope to do is we'll have 1 or 2 or more blogs that can be sent out over the course of the time to, link into or key into the paper. And finally, last but not least, and this is just the immediate getting them up on the site, if there are any changes to the papers, we can always make them because it's just digital. We can download it. If there's comments that people make and you think that it sort of, you have to rethink something, the easiest thing to do would be either to download it and then make the changes as a PDF and then send them back and we can upload them. So, the good news is that bravo to everybody. We're getting there. And you know, it's actually very exciting. So I really appreciate everybody's you know, participation and time. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and turn it back to everybody else.
Denise, I got a question on
Sure.
how you want this done with the glossary. Are the terms going to be in the paper, and is it such that you click on? Are we going to have it such that if you click on a word that is highlighted, it will go, or is it just at the end of the paper there will be all this glossary?
Can you hold on a second? I can answer that question in a moment, but I need to answer somebody's question who's lurking at my door. Hold on.
Okay.
That was convenient.
Well, while Denise has stepped away, I can certainly say how it's set up right now if you haven't looked. How it's set up right now is just that on each of our pages for the stories, there's a link that says something, I think it's complex adaptive systems. You click through and there's just kind of like a big long page with all these different terms with a short paragraph about each one. They're not, as Mark was asking, specifically linked to, you know, to stuff in each of the stories.
Okay. So
okay. I'm back now and I can answer that. So I know that Bruce can't go to it, but anybody who's in front of their computer can indeed go to, I had sent out links to everybody. The key is so if you clicked on, I just put in the glossary. If you clicked glossary, it just has all the terms there. And that's just for someone who's interested in going well beyond what might be in the paper. The complex adaptive system is a really good example. So you click on complex adaptive system, the toggle literally opens a new box, which has that specific definition there. The reason why, which is just easy, it is way beyond my time commitment to do internal PDF links back to toggles and pages and all this other stuff. If somebody wants to take that on, they are welcome to take it on. But this will give, if for no other, for however long it lasts, somebody's download the paper, they can open it up on their on their phone or their iPad or other mobile device, and they can say, wow, I'm really interested in knowing what a complex adaptive system is. It's going to be there. I don't even have, interestingly enough, I don't even have Adobe Creative, so I can't even do some of the Adobe PDF concepts and things that that other people can do. I mean, you can do big publications and all this other stuff. If anyone is interested and wants to do it, then I would suggest sending the papers with all those links already embedded in them, if that answers your question.
Yes, it does, except we will be putting, just understand this. We're going to be putting for each one of our papers the glossary terms. And if it's in the main glossary, we're copying it into our paper, or is it just going to take us to the big glossary?
Okay, if you go to your page, Mark.
Yeah, I am. That's what I'm
okay.
trying.
You had two terms that you had systems, and right now we don't really have a systems thing. But what I was going to do is I was going to do the simple, complicated, complex term. So what you will see is you'll see the glossary, which is just there as an overall glossary. Then underneath it, click on complex adaptive system.
I see it, right.
And then when you click on it, the definition is there.
Oh, good.
There are so many terms that I wanted to, it's really a service to the reader. And I'll put in the simple, complicated, and complex, which is the other thing that you use in your paper. And those, I believe, are the only two complexity reference terms that you have. If there are others, send them, but go to the site where you'll see the longer definitions. And that's what I'm saying. It's the easiest thing is for someone to just cut and paste it and send it to me. At least in the interim. Ultimately, there'll be someone who will be doing all of this, I hope. Volunteers for anybody who isn't attending today. But what I'm trying to do is have it so that somebody who's coming to the site, because we want it to be site specific at this point. Someone who's coming to the site and wants to read this, or download the paper or read the paper, they'll be able to do it, and then stay on the site and use the terminology that we are consistently, hopefully, building and using within Plexus. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes. Building our little complexopedia, or whatever you want to call it.
Right, a complexopedia. Any thoughts, Brooke, on that? You look like either you're listening intently or you're ruminating.
I'm looking on the website now and trying to go back and forth between understand how to get to the glossary and definitions and things. So I'm just, I'm listening as well.
Okay, great. So a paper, and then I won't talk about this anymore, but a paper that had 12 terms would have in that toggle list would have all 12 terms there. So Bruce hasn't sent me his list of terms, and Peter hasn't sent me his list of terms. So when you two send them, I do believe, having read both of your papers, which I love, that there were lots of terms there. And so I know that requisite variety is one of them, and I think that we may need to either add that or expand that within the glossary, but that aside. So it will become sort of a self-contained reference versus a reference that you have to go back to the glossary. The only reason that the overall glossary is there, and if you guys think that it's not necessary, is I just thought it was important for people to know that we had a contextual glossary where, we're not just making these things up. They're all referenced from the Plexus glossary.
And I think too, if the part of the intention is drawing people in who are facing complex challenges, but are not familiar with these concepts and methods, to me, it's a real plus and an asset to be able to offer to them that sort of foundational stuff, which is what that glossary is all about. I think that's a good thing to have.
So now in our curated resources, under complexity resources, we have a glossary. We have the key terms and terminology, which are more of those. They tend, as I said, mentioned, they're the ones that came out of the Adaptive Positive Deviance book. And then we have applied complexity library, which will be the listings of all the papers. So I'm just trying to curate and collate all of these resources so they are pretty easy for people to get to. And you'll notice that the drop-down boxes have been simplified as well.
Denise, you help doing all this stuff, or if everybody does their stuff, it's easy for you to put things on the.
Well, until we get some money, we can hire somebody to do it, or you want to pay me. No, that's a selfish comment, but yes,
No,
it was real. I love this. I think it was really great, and I get completely obsessed because I want it to be as good as possible. But I think now that I have the template, I feel like I have to say to everyone, give me as much information as you can. And what I did was I also went into Google Docs and I updated what people needed to send. So you'll see that even in the Catalyzing Stories folder on Google Docs, all of that stuff has been updated. So I think it's becoming, it'll be pretty easy. Someone should go there. They should read what they need to send when they submit the paper. And so that we can start to get and Amanda, who's not on right now, but was really gracious in doing the photos. So we have a consistent photo with the green circle, which is really, it looks really nice. I love it. And yes, yours has been updated, Bob, too. So I think what I'm trying to do is, at least for what we have on there, it looks very clean and very professional. And it should be pretty self-evident to people. If you want the kind of things that we have on the templates, here's what you need to send.
One question I have is, if there was a new term, would we need to have consensus on that would even be on the document? If there was some new term that came out that maybe was new to all of us or to some of us.
Well, I guess, that's a really interesting question, because I think that will, depending on, from my perspective, if the term is a new term, it may not go into the glossary immediately, but I would suggest that the author, acknowledge the fact that it's a new term and that they define what the term is. And I also think that ultimately, as things evolve, there will be people who, and one part of the reason why we've been such sticklers on guidelines and how people are sharing things is because we didn't want somebody to start to use, the word complex. They're really referring to is something that has nothing to do with
Right.
where that word, originated. And so I think if the language and the consistency in which we're using it is for what people are familiar with is there, that's good. And if it's a completely new term, it should probably be highlighted, and it'll probably be discussed during the editing and vetting process. Does that make sense, Brooke?
Yes.
Yeah, just a thought on that. It's I'm thinking ahead, and I'm always thinking ahead on what can go wrong, so I apologize. It is so easy. My experience is that it's so easy to come up with new terms with best of intention that are either unclear or redundant with existing, acknowledged, already used terms. And I just think we need to be really careful about that.
And that's why I brought it up.
It's one thing if there are
I don't want you to be distracted.
Staples of knowledge
I
or
know.
locus of knowledge within the broader topic and community, and those terms are generally used. That's one thing. But I just think moving forward, we just need to be real careful about selecting new terms and whether or not they're really new terms.
Right.
So I have a question, Barb. I want you to jump in on this. That's interesting. So I would distinguish at this moment in time, it's a great example. And thank you for bringing this up, Bob. And thank you for saying that, Brooke. Barb and I have been working on this, project and model. It's a tool set called Awarefulness, and Amanda. And it's not necessarily a term at this point. I mean, we're using it and we are defining it, but the question is I wouldn't put awarefulness into the, a complexity glossary. I may, the same way that we use adaptive positive deviance as something, it is a model methodology versus a complexity term. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's more like it's proprietary rather than part of the overall body of knowledge in a certain sense.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to you. And one thing that occurred to me, if there are those kinds of terms of art that are unique to the particular author, to you or Barb, Amanda, or whoever, could those simply be put in as footnotes to your own papers, so that wherever that occurs in your text, you just simply put in a little footnote, number 10. And then at the end where the footnotes are, there's a short couple of sentences that explain, and awarefulness is this, and we're building that, and it's a tool, whatever it is. And then it's simply part of the body of the text of the paper as well. I don't know if that makes sense or if that solves the problem.
Now, this is an interesting thing. So in our paper, we define a new term, embodied communication, which is somewhat based on a accepted term, not a complexity term, but an accepted term called embodied cognition. And so, that's an interesting question because it's not a complexity term, but it is a well-defined term. And that I'm wondering. So do we just not include it, or?
We would include it, but it wouldn't be something that would be a complexity.
Exactly.
I mean, because you'll see in Peters, there's additional references in books. I mean, if there were additional, and Bruce is also working on, I'm really, calling you to order today, Bruce, is working on some some sort of language and some consistency on, if you're interested in working with Plexus or me and Plexus
Right.
around blah, 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 please contact, and here are the things. So it's sort of, we're going to have a soft sell that will be on each author's page too, as appropriate. And so that is, I think that's that will also come through with the vetting and curating process. Sometimes it will be appropriate, sometimes it won't. Peter will probably be doing something of that nature. But I think, Barb, if we had a paper that we put into the Catalyzing Stories project, which would be different than what we're working on for the sort of the selling marketing thing, then I would probably reference, or I would have as additional resources, please read our, sort of background construct and model on awarefulness, or we use the term embodied communication. For those of you who are interested, it emerged out of work that we did around blah, 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 blah. So, but it would not be on, at least from my perspective, it's not part of the glossary for, the Plexus complexity nonlinear definitions and glossary. What do you think about that, Brooke?
Well, I think we're going to have to go about it piece by piece.
Yep. Okay.
As we go forward, because let me take the most obvious term, complex. There's everyday usage of that term and complexity. And then there's how complexity and all derivations of complexity management, complexity thinking, complexity science, complexity theory is used in this small bubble of a sphere that, that we play in here. And the same is true for other terms as well. All the terms, just we can't make it unless we really make up a new word, right?
Right.
So we're going to have to deal with that, because I think if you do a quick Google search on any one of these terms, two things come to mind. One, do a quick Google search on any one of these terms. You see a variety of different definitions, including awarefulness, embodied communication, embodied cognition, complexity, all that. They're all there. The other thing that's interesting to me is that if you've ever done a search on Google Trends, okay, if you do a search, we might be able to do that now and just pull it up on complexity thinking, complexity science, whatever derivation of it. You'll see the trend of it. Then if you overlay another search, like a more common term, like, I don't know, operational excellence or strategy, you see how small, minuscule percentage of the Google searches are on complexity topics and things relative toward other things that are more well known in business or in organizations, regardless of what the organizations are for. My takeaway from that is, depending upon what we want to do here with the organization, how much should we be really looking at explaining things in terms that are applicable to what other people think?
Love the question, and this is really interesting. I think that would be, Bruce made some reference, but I think that it would be, a footnote or a reference within, if it's being used completely differently. I personally, and I'm not the arbiter of this, but I think that the originating spot comes from, that glossary of terms and definitions, which, came from, Brenda Zimmerman used it, and Jeff Goldstein used it, and everybody who had, the early sort of thinkers of the field and Plexus members who said, this is complexity science, but we've really looked at this relative to how did it emerge, what's it being used as? And it does have much more of an academic bent, but from a reference standpoint, we say you start there. And then the next evolution of it, if someone is using complexity management, and that is, there's no glossary definition for complexity management, I would sort of think that, and you're right, it might be piecemeal, but I would say that the author might want to say, something, complexity management is a terminology that has been, in the fields for blah, 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 and then maybe have a reference, or it's, we use this, and it's more closely aligned to somebody, complexity management from Forbes magazine or HBS. But I think that those are the kinds of distinctions and the quality of sort of vetting that the authors need to do. You know, you're not going to just throw terms around.
Yeah, I know, and I know that my bias and what I do professionally and the way I look at some of this stuff is to recognize that bumper stickers and labels become very ambiguous extremely quickly.
Yes.
And I would much rather spend a little bit of time using the specific phrase that is more pertinent to what I'm actually meaning than trying to use a short phrase label or bumper sticker. But that's just me.
No, but I think that as, you know, this group, because this is the group that's been working so intently on everything, you know, and the 3 of the papers are up there, you know, I think that if anybody reads it and there's a, you know, and there's some like, you know, you're using complexity management, you haven't given any reference. I think it's, you know, it's easy to go back to, you know, to an author or somebody else and say, you know, something, this just popped out. I read it for the 10th time and I realized you use complexity management in every other sentence. So where did it come from? How are you thinking and using it? Now, part of that, I hope that as a self-organizing professional network, that starts to come up. And it may be in a discussion, or it's something that would allow people to really, you know, to build clarity. And, you know, as I think Bruce said, you know, the complexopedia or whatever he called it, because I think that's where, you know, the fact that we're even having that conversation, I think is really important and cool. But I do feel that we're grounded somewhere that anybody in that minuscule little world would say, you know, they didn't make up a whole glossary. This glossary came from somewhere. And now they're doing a good effort at trying to, you know, say if they change it or it's been adapted, here's how those authors are adapting it.
So Denise, this brings me to my next topic, and I want to move to it because we've got a long agenda today. The next topic is a revised review process. And what I think, and I talked to Brooke about this, I think the process of trying to have a committee work this whole thing is it's very labor intensive. It's very slow. And so I'm proposing a new process today, which is that each author buddies up with somebody on this team. So for example, I've been working a lot with Susan, and Prusha has been working with Connie. And so we have one key person. And what I learned in working with Bruce is that if you don't sort of develop a relationship with the author, you can start doing reviews and then it comes across as very arbitrary and it can create some tension. So by having this relationship of one person with somebody else, you get questions like, hey, what do you mean by that term? Okay, if there's a big disagreement, Denise has become and I know she doesn't like this word, but somewhat of an arbiter, you know, because, you know, she'll kind of finally make a decision, hey, this is good enough. But we haven't reached the point where somebody says, oh, God, this is terrible. And, you know, Denise has to decide between the author and the reviewer. So unless there's some objection to this approach, this is the way, because this speeds the process up. It goes, but it develops a relationship between that. And so that when the terms get used, if the reviewer is saying, wait, I don't understand this term, we can also bring it up to the group. You know, we're having a difficulty of this term, so if there's some issue that's really want to break in and have the group, we can do that also. That doesn't remove the responsibility of people to look at the document on the website as it's being evolved and make comments. You know, Bruce has looked at almost all of them. I've looked at almost all of them. Brooke has looked at a lot of them. Barb has looked at some. So we're getting comments, and the comments are really good for the author to be able to make their next pass. So I just want to have a discussion on whether that's a review approach that kind of streamlines things but still works as a review. one-on-one relationship. Everybody gets a chance to review, and then Denise, at the end, when she gets something pretty good, so she doesn't have to spend all her time, trying to solve all these problems, gets to read it and say, hey, I'm comfortable with it, go on the site. Yes, Barb.
I would suggest having two people review, that the author develops a relationship with two people.
Okay.
One person looks at the overall structure and can actually, from the paper, diagram out what the person is trying to say, so that there's clarity in the story. And then another person is reading it more closely. What does this term mean? Not to say that people can't be doing both, but I think that it's hard to read both and give critique back in both. And we need both. We need somebody to read the overall diagram of what's being said and somebody to be reading it more closely.
Whether Prusha knows it or not, she's been sort of the person who reads it really closely and makes a lot of comments. But she might, I don't want to speak for you, Prusha, but if you could continue that role, it'd be great.
Okay.
Wow. Wow, that's a big one. Prusha's been deeply involved, and she's actually writing blog posts that often go along with the papers. So I want to do a shout out to Prusha. She's been really good. So I think what happens is when we have a situation where somebody defines a term, this will be part of the overall review process. And if the term is, vague or it doesn't fit, or, if the reviewer is reading and searching for other people who've defined the term, then we can actually, so part of the process will do that. So I like that, Barb. We'll have two people. If Prusha can't do something for the overall details of it, then we'll get somebody else.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
What's the current view on whether or not we're asking people to actually kind of create a storyboard or something?
I've asked people to do a storyboard for the things that have not been. See, the storyboard came after people wrote many of their papers. So the current papers didn't have a storyboard, though I encouraged every author to do the storyboard. Future papers, I'm going to require people to do the storyboard.
Yeah, I want to jump in. So at this point in time, I think we only have one more story that was pre-storyboard opportunity.
Two.
Correct?
Two. Yeah, the capstone story and the David Hurst.
Right. Well, I'm going to consider the capstone just sort of an add-on for you. So leave that over here. So David, but I think, and that's why I was raising my hand. I think it would become, at this point in time, we have, and all of us put in there, but Brooke really led the charge. Shout out to Brooke, with, the storyboard, the guidelines, and they're really good. And I think it's really important for, if you think we need to update it for that little blurb about terminology, I made a note in my head, Brooke, that maybe we want to add that as another point of the guidelines. But I think we need to make sure that before Prusha and whoever the mentor or the buddy is for the story, it should be pretty close to what they think is 90%. So, they've identified the terms, they've got because I think that if they do the storyboard, and if at any point in the process they say, this is what I really want to write, never done this before, I am a little confused on the storyboard, I think that there's they have an opportunity to say, hey, let's, I'd like to get a group of people together to sort of explain it. But now that we have potential stories up there and they can look at the complexity library, they'll be able to see what's been written before and what's coming out. And that should really be a big help, but the storyboard has to be mandatory at this point.
Yeah, it is. It should be mandatory. We grandfathered in the people who stories were well along. but future stories it's mandatory to do the storyboard. And let me talk about future stories right now. We've got Connie, who said she's going to try to get her story done. She actually may be grandfathered in because she actually wrote the story and now is rewriting it, but I'm going to ask her to do the storyboard. We've got Deborah Garrison, who's doing a remarkable story on her experience as a provost and as a dean at colleges and how she worked in the academic world to bring people together. The academic world, as many of you know, can be very divisive. People are very committed to their viewpoints. And she had to work through a tremendous number of really complex relationships, and she's going to be talking about that. We have Susan Hasty, who I think is producing a really fantastic story about the deep psychological. She's talking about that there are many, people say that businesses fail because they don't have enough capital, they don't have a good understanding of their markets, all the classic things. And what she has found is those are symptoms of a problem. Oftentimes the problem has to do with the relationships that people have, the psychological aspects of how they operate. So she's writing a story about herself as well as another client and how they work through the more deep fundamental problems that face it. One of the things I'm learning about as I read these stories is that to operate effectively in a complex system, one has to have a great deal of self-awareness. It is oftentimes against our psychological need. Our needs are often to control, or our needs are often to are driven by fear, and so she's talking about that. And then Bob, I'd like you to talk about where you stand on your story, if you're still in the right one. And so we might have up to 9 or 10 stories from this group. Bob, can you? You're mute. Bob, you have to unmute.
Hi. Yes. No. Denise kind of knows. I'm learning a lot right now, and I'm trying to put together kind of a spot where it brings all that together. But my story hasn't evolved beyond what's in my head, and I'm continually trying to simplify it. So that's kind of where I'm at, is trying to. It's gotten quite complex in my head, but I think it's becoming very good for simplifying it within the language of, let's say, a 7-year-old, or because that's the kind of people I worked with was kids in grade school and high school and early childhood. So that's kind of where I'm at, is how that would how these complexity ideas could be used by, let's say, a teacher or a parent in framing the world around them.
So Bob, I suggest you read the stories that are already, the 3 stories that are published, because they all work from a very personal standpoint.
Right.
You start out with, this is what, this is my story, okay? And then it sort of evolves into what does this mean in terms of how, what I think about complexity and what I think is important. So if you read them, I think it might give you some real understanding of what we as a community think is a successful story.
Right. Yeah, no, I appreciate that, because it does go back to my work in my community on the idea of what it means to be a systems thinker, and how if you are going to deal with complexity, you do need to be a systems thinker, and that is kind of the heart of the idea, and yeah, that's been embedded in the work I did with the kids, and it unfortunately is still embedded in what keeps popping up every day in the information in reference to what Brooke talked about with complex systems, the new definition of complex systems as per the podcast I watched 3 days ago. And that's framing it into some new terms. But I certainly wouldn't go there in my book or my chapter. But I think that the venue that we have here is very exciting for me, because I do think that the information and the complexity is exploding right in front of us, and the ability to interact with other people and explore how dynamic of a world we're living in right now is pretty exciting for me.
Bob, one of the things that we had some early conversations on, like with Mark and Barb and Denise and Prusha, was as we think about a story, it's a story of the author is telling. And it's easy to first think about just telling the story, but then if we think about, well, tell the story about the author's learning journey through the story. That framing it or looking at it that way may help you think about how to simplify it and communicate some pieces of it.
Bob, I would suggest you go through that. On the website there is the storyboard, and before I do any more writing, I would actually fill that storyboard in and send that out for people to review. I think that's a really important aspect of it.
And I will. I'll probably try to capture Denise for 1 second, just to let her know that I'm working on her other project very hard too. And so these two merge together somewhere along the line.
Well, we're getting stories in, so it's not like you have to get it next week or something like that. But I think by the summer, it'd be really good to have it. Yeah. So I want to segue to what's next, and there are two aspects of what's next. One is we're going to, and Prusha said she might help lead this activity, and I'll help lead it too, podcasts. We want to have multiple mediums. One of the things that this project's evolving is, if you look at Plexus, it is really applying complexity principles to dealing with complex systems. It's application. We're not so focused on the deep theory, and so there are many ways that you can deal with that. You can deal with how do you use certain techniques. Plexus has adaptive positive deviance, other techniques that people can utilize, but it's applying things. The other is to read stories and to learn from the stories what other people went through and how they approached it and what issues come to. We're about telling stories. And, I had this vision of us becoming the radio. Does everybody know about the Radio Moth Hour?
Yes.
Okay. I envision us becoming the Moth Hour for complexity stories, and so that's both stories written, and also because the Moth Hour has books afterwards and has podcasts. So I was wondering if anybody else would like to join the group of us, Prusha and me, right now, in terms of organizing and structuring out how we do a podcast.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to just
absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to jump in for a moment, and I'm going to just say before we jump into this, I love this. I mean, I've been advocating this concept for a long time, and I love the Moth Hour. But one of the things that I'm going to absolutely say is that the final podcast that's delivered should be of the highest possible quality. So Amen. All I'm going to say to this group and anyone who listens to this recording is you better find a place that knows how to do podcasts. And so there's places called the Podcast Garage, or there may be local meetups of people who do podcasts. Reach out to like Human Current. who has, by the way, a giant media company behind them doing the podcast. So, but what I want to be certain is that the podcast is not just a recording. It's got a consistent visualization in the front. It usually has some kind of a specific, a introduction. And in order to do that and to get any kind of traction, because if we don't get traction, then it's not worth anybody's effort, because it takes a lot of time. It has to be thought out and, thank you, storyboarded ahead of time, maybe. And then have a hook, like, are there 5 questions that are asked of every person that does a podcast? What's your favorite complexity term? There needs to be something that's a hook, and then it ties back to the story, a catalyzing stories or something of that nature. So I think it's terrific, but I think it really needs to be very well thought out. And and then at that point in time to find either the resources from a volunteer standpoint or the resources otherwise in order to have it produced correctly.
Well, I'm tempted to start a Kickstarter program to try to get some resources to do this. So it would be nice to have some resources. But Denise, I'd like you to be part of the first or second meeting that we have on this.
I'm happy to do that, but I think that somebody, before you even have the first meeting, should literally design the structure, use the storyboard concept or a version of that. Go online, figure out who is doing the best podcasts, see if there are, I know that for a fact that there are online free courses on how to do a podcast. There's places in the Boston area, podcast garages in the Boston area, where you can go and spend a weekend learning how to do a podcast. I think that before you have the first meeting, I would really have a firm structure outline. Then at that point in time, then you can say, open it up to as many, the Plexus community again, but already tell them, we're not in the early stages. We have a structure, but now what we're going to do is there any interest? Is this something of any value? Here's what we're thinking. Do we have people who are doing or have done podcasts? And it really, I think that that's really important. It is a very intense media system. And I think that we need to make sure that we get the resources and that we have the people who want to do them recognize that it's not just speaking into a microphone.
I'd like to add that before any fundraising is done in the name of Plexus, that it be a board level approval to do that.
Yeah,
I agree.
Great idea.
Yeah.
Great point.
We only have so many opportunities to ask, and we should be strategic about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple thoughts on this as well. One thought, Mark, is I think it was Connie that said that she is doing or has been creating a podcast. So you might want to just touch with her. And then the other thought is, we've talked about podcasts, we've talked about webinars or whatever. So if I just look at those two, strategically, which would make more sense to go and do first?
Right.
Tell me the two things. I missed it. I was writing.
A podcast or webinar?
Webinar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And again, so I feel far more competent, comfortable to guide people to do webinars or whatever. But again, there are people like OG Network has quarterly, maybe every month, they offer a paid webinar on something. And having produced it for Plexus and OD Network and many years ago for many, many people, to do it correctly is also very time consuming. And again, it should be, because I think the best ones are the ones that people will pay for, and they, and that is strategic, and it has something, has a hook. Now, it could be that the webinars also have, the audio of the webinar is recorded and it's quality enough that it can be post-production offered as a, an audio download, not quite a podcast, but an audio download. But I think that those are things that needs to be done, but all of it has to be done strategically. And I don't know why I keep saying this, but I think that using at least the methodology of, what the story is, the storyboard is going to be helpful for either one of them.
Well, my suggestion is that Prusha, Bruce, and I make it small, get together as a pre-meeting to do some of the thinking that you've been talking about, and then bring it back to this group so we have something to do on. Bruce, you okay with that?
Yeah, this is Bruce. I'm driving and I can't really see all of you, but I've been listening. And I just wanted to jump in real quickly on the podcast and webinar issue. I've produced and hosted about 50 webinars. I haven't done too many podcasts, but a couple of quick points on that. I totally agree with the notion of having a clear sort of story arc or arc to what the podcast message is going to be. I don't know if all of you, but some of you may be familiar with Nancy Duarte and her book and her work on creating powerful stories, highly recommended in this particular application. And the other piece I think Denise or somebody else mentioned is the need for really high quality audio and production values if you're going to be doing podcasts. There is, like Denise said, there's all kinds of resources that are out there, but to me, the two pieces go hand in hand. Crafting that basic arc of what the teller's story will be, whether it's the Moth or TED Talks or whatever. If you're going to be a TED Talk speaker, they literally coach you for 6 months about how to deliver and structure your TED Talk. That's how important that arc is to them. And I think that we really do, as Denise said, need to be very mindful of how to coach and how to craft and how to structure and how to produce those kinds of stories and arcs and podcast and webinar materials, and I'll leave it
there. Some of you don't probably know this, but some of the folks on the board when having this, we're going to be having a conversation around a business model for Plexus and what that business model looks like. And it strikes me that this conversation starts to dovetail and be part of the business model conversation. Because there are various type of products or services that Plexus may want to focus on to deliver, create, or promote. And these are just two of those that fall into that conversation.
So, Brooke, I think what we'll be doing here is developing proposals. So we will follow the lead of where the board's heading. If the board doesn't think this is, worthy, we will respect that where we end up. I'm sure the board will have something to do with this project, otherwise it wouldn't have continued. But we will have to bring that to the business model. I agree with you.
One thing that jumps out at me is what Denise said about the strategic idea. And then, like, for example, like if I were to tell you my story, I might want to give you the underlying hooks that I'm trying to put out, but they may not be obvious. And that's what worries me about sometimes people telling stories and there's no strategic idea of what Plexus is trying to do because there's not a consensus of what that story means. And so that seems to be a big problem out there on the internet with when you go to complex systems or that kind of thing. There's some people I know who say, well, it's just about telling the story, everyone telling their story, but then it's always being framed into their own mental model. And I'm thinking that Plexus might have some common denominators of what the mental model is, what the strategy is that we're trying to convey in the stories we're telling.
So Bob, one of the things that we're going to be doing, and we've talked about this, is that when we have these stories out there, we're going to be looking across and seeing what's common to them. and hoping to extract certain commonalities. So the 3 stories we have now, there are a lot of, there are a whole bunch of commonalities to them, and their differences. So one of the things we will do, I envision, as we get more and more stories done, is begin to get the group as a group to figure out what do these stories kind of say as a group, you know, or what are some of the common themes.
No, that's good. Yep.
So the next subject is something that will also be part of the business meeting and is very important, and that is, so we have all these stories. How do we promote them? The only thing I know right now is that everybody in Plexus, we try to get as many people in Plexus to interact with their own networks, to let people know that these stories are there, that they can be valuable. But I think one of our big issues are, I'd hate to have 8 or 9 stories and 15 people eventually look at them. So does anybody have ideas on how we promote, other than each one of us? Like, I have 100 people in my network. Some of them have been involved with, you know, the stories that I actually wrote. And then we have everybody in Plexus who has a network. But does anybody have any other ideas other than?
Well, this sounds like it's coming from outer space. My son is a web developer, and I asked him to look at why the Plexus website loads so slowly. And he's done a very comprehensive look at what's going on with the website. And he has said that one of the reasons that we are very low on Google and our SEO is not working. He's in the middle of writing a report about what's going on. But, you know, again, this is something for the Plexus board meeting. And once he writes his report, we can look and see what needs to be done. The site is built on another site, built on another site. And I think all of this overlaying has created some real problems, that we have so many broken links in the site that anybody who mentions Plexus, even if we do get a social media link, it just then ends up at a broken link or at a very slow loading site. And so as far as SEO and social media, I think we need to wait for my son's report to see what's going on. He was quite impressed and has not offered to fix it because it's a big
Well, this is going to get back to the board discussion on you know, how far can we go without some paid staff and some real, you know, some power to do. I mean, we have great ambitions, but they all cost time and money. So I'm going to defer that. I just think that for Plexus to succeed now, we're going to have to, each of us personally, try to promote it in some way. So I'm going to leave that to the board meeting, and next time we meet, we'll talk about we're having a meeting next Wednesday, right, Brooke?
Yes, I believe it's that.
Yeah. So we'll have some ideas after that we can report back.
One idea I have on that would be to be aware of your network, and then I just think of you folks here. If I can make a couple links to you, then that creates a bigger network, and it's called your center of gravity. And the largest center of gravity out there right now is Vanguard, Blackwater hedge fund, and the S&P 500. And so you map the interconnections to see what that center of gravity is, and that creates momentum. And so that's what they're doing on the internet, is it's mapping. So like market, like in your story, then you can tell what your network is, your 100 people, and then you frame that network, and then Brooke frames his network, and you merge those together within your story. And so and there's a program called Kumu that maps those things out. And then you can zoom in and zoom out to see how that network is growing or collapsing or whatever. And so that's the mirror image of what they would say consciousness is. It is reflecting it in the same way of neural networks of the internet. And so it's kind of like becoming aware of your network, seeing how you can connect those nodes, and actually have a transformational nonlinear change of how those interconnections are.
But Bob, how does that relate to the stories? I mean, I could
It relates completely into the stories. By you telling your story and networking it with Brooks or mine, then we connect in a completely different pattern. Your 100 no longer stays just around you. It may expand to Barb's or someone else's. So you're getting transformational changes of that network.
Well, that strikes me as being as much of a marketing and communication effort as it is about the stories themselves. The stories have tended to be, and I suspect will continue to be, more personal narrative. The marketing effort around them absolutely can and perhaps should focus on that interconnection, the stuff that June Hawley and Valdez Krebs and others that we know of our Plexus family talk about with regard, as you say, to weaving those social networks and linking our networks together.
Yes, totally agree. Yes.
Yep. June may be very valuable in this. Okay, well, I'm going to delay this topic until after the board meeting, and then I think we're going to focus on this. And then the last step is to reevaluate a book. Now, what happens with the Moth Radio Hour, or is that what they do is they take some of the best stuff and they create a book out of it. So at some point, we might have 20, 30 stories. Other people might be. We're going to be inviting other people to actually do this. But unless somebody has an objection, I'd like to get through the podcast or the webinar or both, and have more stories done, and then revisit the book. As Denise has said, a book is a pretty intense project. But the book is not out of the question. It's just a question of it's the next phase if we're going to go there. Any comments on that?
I hope it comes to pass, but I understand the need to move forward on these other aspects of this first.
Okay. Denise, you still there? I think she's off. Any other topics that we need to discuss now? So the next steps are, I'm going to get to the people who are in the process of writing. Going to ask them to make sure they do the storyboard. I'm going to ask them to pick somebody who is going to work with them along with Pusha. And then we're going to wait for the board meeting, and then we'll meet again for a conversation on how we do podcast. In the meantime, Bruce, Pusha, and I will meet. I'll try to set something up like within a week or two to talk about podcasts. And I'm not even sure I know the difference between a webinar and a podcast, but I'll learn.
Especially if it's a video podcast.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll meet again maybe in the next month after we have the board meeting, and we're moving forward. I think we've experienced a lot of what complexity is about. We started this project with what are we doing, and what does this mean, and what is our purpose, and somehow it's beginning to gel. So I really thank all of us. I think it's been a fantastic learning experience for me. At some points, I didn't think we'd ever get to convergence. I think seeing the 3 stories that are really good and knowing that other people are writing good stories, I think we have something valuable here, and now we have to move forward. Any other comments before we end?
Really appreciate everybody's time and effort for sure.
Yep. Okay.
Yes, Val.
We're looking forward to the next meeting when we have the board meeting.
Okay.
Okay.
All the best.
Thanks, Peter, for your article, and thanks for really working well with us to get something really positive. Really,
It's been fun.
proud of what you did.
If anyone has time for me, that would be great.
And Bruce, great story. I love it.
Thank you much.
Okay, everybody. Nice talking to you all. Bye-bye.
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 Bye. Denise, are you still there?